Melissa Cooper is struggling to stay on her feet. It's February 2, 1999, and the 22-year-old had moments earlier developed severe stomach pain and nausea as she sat on her bed in Unit 11 of her short-term efficiency apartment in Punta Gorda, Florida. She stumbles out of the apartment and drags her feet to the local Circle K convenience store, where she hopes to get some medication, but instead collapses inside. Melissa's a type 1 diabetic, and she was without her insulin. She wakes in the custody of paramedics, who take her to Charlotte Regional Medical Center. After stabilizing her blood sugar levels, hospital staff call a taxi to take her back to the Trail Apartments that same night. Days later, on Valentine's Day, Melissa vacuums the carpet, makes the bed, cleans the bathroom sink, and wipes the kitchen floor and counters, and then packs her suitcase, checks out of the apartment, and then heads to the airport for a one-way flight out to Wisconsin to stay with her sister, who was told by Melissa that day from a payphone in Walmart that she was coming over to stay. A week later, that sister gets a call. It's their mom Deborah calling from Hollywood, Florida, and she wants to speak with Melissa. As she puts the phone to her ear, Melissa can hear the increasing pitch of a male voice in the background of the other end of the line.
Where is she?
Deborah will then ask Melissa a question that would linger for 18 years. Melissa, where's Pilar? The answer to her mother's question was that she didn't have 4-year-old Pilar Rodriguez. More alarming still was that her answer to investigators in Wisconsin was that her father came and took her back to Hollywood, Florida. What police had to wrestle with was that just the night before, Hollywood police received a missing person 911 call from none other than Pilar's father, Marco Rodriguez, who said he was told that Melissa, Pilar's babysitter, was in a different state. Melissa's end destination was supposed to be Hollywood, where she and the child's father lived. By the time Melissa was answering police questions, it had been 3 weeks since she took a Hollywood Greyhound bus with the child on January 31, 1999 to Punta Gorda, a roughly 160-mile trip from the state's east to its west coast. The two stayed in Unit 11 of a set of small short-term efficiency rooms called the Trail Apartments. Just 2 days after arriving on February 2, Melissa suffered that diabetic episode where she ended up at the hospital, which left Pilar alone in the apartment for hours. When Melissa returned that night, she said Pilar wasn't there. On the day Melissa was questioned at the Caledonia, Wisconsin Police Department, a team of Charlotte County investigators swarmed the Trail Apartment and began taking photos of the outside and the inside of the unit in which they stayed. Detectives knew why Pilar was with Melissa, how the two ended up at the apartment, and they also knew that Melissa and Marco did not have the child. But they had two major problems. One, they didn't know whether she was alive and missing or dead. And two, after a neighborhood canvass, they couldn't get witness testimony or evidence yet that would place the child at the apartment at all. A search of Marco's and Melissa's apartments in Hollywood yielded nothing. All they could hope for was some type of DNA match, which was made more difficult by the fact that even if this was a homicide case, which it wasn't at that point, there was no body. As such, a search warrant was obtained to comb through Unit 11, which at the time of the search was inhabited by another tenant. The search took 3.5 days to complete. There were several photos taken, including of the outside of the apartment, the bedroom, the closet, the bathroom, and the kitchen. Evidence collected included a sponge mop and swabs of different locations of the residence. Luminol was used on the carpet, which showed 2 possible blood spots. Cutouts of the carpeting that had those spots and dark-colored hairs from the bathroom were also collected. Outside the apartment, search teams combed the county for any signs of the child. Detective Michael Gandy of the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office described the search as extensive and required the assistance of surrounding counties. They searched far and wide, often propelled by tips from an engaged community. Search areas included cemeteries in nearby Cleveland, nurseries, pine trails, wooded areas, dump sites, landfills, and even areas with reported vulture sightings. Helicopters and heat detection devices were used at the outset as search teams walked every night. The exhaustive nature of the search was punctuated by the extraordinary draining of the acres-large, 8-foot-deep Preacher's Lake, which took several weeks to complete. Search and rescue efforts focused on the lake because there was a report of small female clothing in the wooded area near the body of water. But their efforts bore no fruit. When Melissa left with the child to Punta Gorda on the 31st of January, she didn't have a set date to come back to Hollywood. That didn't bother Marco and Melissa's mother Deborah because the babysitter and the child had made that same trip a weekend or two before, even if it was only an overnight stay at a motel. But the circumstances by which the energetic child was put into Melissa's care was not necessarily by choice. It would be more apt to describe the situation as Pilar fortuitously thrust on Melissa during a very difficult period for two families just trying to make ends meet. The Cooper family bounced around relatively frequently. Deborah's 3 children were raised in Mundelein, Illinois, a city near Chicago. Deborah and her husband would divorce when Melissa was about 5 or 6 years old. Minus the occasional birthday card in the mail, Melissa and her younger sister said their father was checked out of the picture, with no replacement figure after him. The family moved to Arkansas for a couple of years before residing in Kentucky, where they stayed near their grandmother and completed high school. While in the city of Flemingsburg, Melissa got a summer job at a hospital working in the medical records department. The family then moved to Wisconsin, where Melissa got a job at McDonald's before the family uprooted again and moved back to Kentucky after a couple of years. It was there that Melissa's mother got her daughter's jobs at the McDonald's in the small town of Owingsville, where Melissa worked as a cashier, her sister worked the back, and her mom worked the drive-thru. The Cooper kids were sheltered, according to them. Having gone to a Christian school, Melissa said there were strict rules about dating boys. It was only allowed when the girls turned 16, and even then they would need a chaperone. Proms and homecomings were sort of off limits as a result. This contrasted drastically with what Melissa's younger sister observed as other high school girls getting pregnant at 14 or 15 years old. Melissa admitted that she had low self-esteem. She was self-conscious about the fact that she was a type 1 diabetic, which meant she was reliant since the age of 13 on an external source of an otherwise internally produced glucose control hormone called insulin. Deborah said her daughter was in denial about her condition, which made her sick because she wasn't getting her blood sugar level stabilized while she was still growing. Her self-esteem problems were compounded by 2 other facts. First, Melissa had a lazy right eye, where her eye doesn't look in the same direction as the other. Second, she didn't have her driver's license. And third, as mentioned, she never previously dated. The obstacles for Melissa made it difficult for her to live what some might consider a regular social life during her high school years. Growing up in a single-family home, we always kind of had a rough life, and we were just kind of chasing happiness, and that's where we just made the decision, Melissa's younger sister said about the impending move to Florida, adding the family lived on a low income and was trying to brighten up their lives with Florida's sunshine, palm trees, and proximity to the ocean. That year, the family moved down to Hollywood, Florida, where they rented an apartment and got a cell phone. But Melissa wasn't committed. After about a week, she confided in her mom that she wanted to go back to Kentucky. Deborah didn't think it was a good idea, but it didn't matter. When Deborah got home from work one day, she saw a letter from Melissa saying that she went back to their home state. A couple of months later, Deborah and her youngest daughter moved apartments and would eventually get rid of the cell phone that Deborah said wasn't being used much, and whose service was too expensive to keep. Instead, phone calls would be made at one of 2 payphones, one on the block's corner and one at the laundromat behind their new apartment. Melissa, by this point, had been gone for about 5 or 6 months when Deborah got a call around Thanksgiving 1998. It was from employees from her former employer, the McDonald's in Owingsville, Kentucky. The call was about Melissa, and it wasn't good. 3 months before that call, on August 23, 1998, a Hollywood cop was patrolling the streets when he spotted a Chevy driving in the wrong direction on a one-way street. He turns on his flashing lights and pulls the car over. Inside was an intoxicated 29-year-old Marco Rodriguez, who failed to show his vehicle's registration or insurance. He was hit with multiple charges, including one related to a theft, though it's unclear if this was related to the vehicle itself, and his license was revoked. He pleaded no contest on December 11 of that year and had fines of around $1,000 levied against him. He also had to pay for the 50 hours of community service he agreed to do. This traffic stop was a pivotal moment in the young man's life, and it probably couldn't have come at a worse time. Born and raised in Peru, Marco came to Hollywood for his studies when he was 19. He had family already residing in the Sunshine State when he came over and obtained his permanent residency card. He studied radiology at first, but then switched over to auto mechanics, but he was never able to finish school. He did, however, have a fallback plan. For a couple of decades, he had been working factory, construction, home remodeling, and painting jobs, and that's how he got by in his new country. About 3 years after arriving in Hollywood, he met his wife Pamela, and the two had their daughter Pilar on February 5, 1995. But when Pilar was around the age of 2, Pamela up and left, he testified, saying his wife allegedly had an issue with drugs. Marco said he tried to maintain contact with her, but that was a difficult endeavor. He alleged she came by all of 2 times to see her daughter, and sometimes wouldn't show up at all when she promised to do so. He alleged Pamela never provided monetary, food, or shelter assistance for Pilar. In fact, he accused her of not wanting anything to do with the child. Pamela's sister testified that in the immediate aftermath of their breakup, Pamela took Pilar back to Dayton, Ohio, where her sister lived, dropped Pilar at her mother's place, and came to live with her for 6 months at the end of 1998. That was, Pilar's sister would say, the last time she would see the child, because Marco would travel to take Pilar back to Hollywood with him. The problems in the Rodriguez household, however, appeared to be a shared experience, according to court records. Marco had been arrested and charged with aggravated battery on a pregnant woman in July 1994, a second-degree felony. Then, as his world was spiraling after his separation from Pamela, he's caught driving under the influence. Marco said he found raising Pilar enjoyable, but difficult, especially considering his financial situation. The DUI in this case was just a twisting of the knife. As while he was able to obtain employment from the people he knew in construction, he couldn't work during the times he needed to do his community service hours. Money was already tight, with food and payments due on a studio apartment he rented for him and his daughter. When he had to go out to do jobs, he would put Pilar in daycare. Now, he couldn't afford any of it. He and his daughter were effectively rendered homeless, until that very same summer. After getting off the phone with the concerned McDonald's employees in Kentucky, Deborah gets on the phone with Melissa to tell her she's arranging travel to get her back to Hollywood. Melissa doesn't resist. But before she comes back, and during one of those phone conversations, Deborah tells Melissa an interesting story. One night, she heard a knock at her apartment door. When she opened, she saw a man named Marco Rodriguez and his 3-year-old daughter Pilar standing sheepishly outside. The shock of the knock this late in the night was perhaps blunted by the fact that Deborah and Marco had actually met previously. And by that, I mean 30 minutes earlier, in the laundromat. I was there doing my laundry, and I just saw Pilar, and she was just a cute little thing that we just struck up a conversation, Deborah recalled to a Charlotte County court. By chance, in the throes of financial difficulty, Marco greets the kind and hospitable Deborah Cooper, who takes a liking to his daughter. When the conversation at the laundromat ended, Deborah said she didn't know she was being followed home until she heard the knock at the door. He told me that he was homeless, his little girl didn't have a place to sleep, and asked me if she could sleep inside, Deborah testified in court. The Coopers take them in that night. Within a week of meeting, Deborah and Marco are dating, but Deborah would later say the relationship was more platonic. For a while, Marco had hitched rides with his co-workers because he had his license revoked, while Deborah would pick up Pilar from the daycare. Marco said he did his best to help with rent, but the inflection point came when he couldn't afford Pilar's daycare. The Coopers were themselves just trying to get by, and that was with Deborah and her daughter working full-time during the day. With Marco out as well on a new job, that left Pilar without a caretaker. But not for long, because this is a story of fortune, and by fortune, I mean chance. When Melissa gets back to Hollywood, Deborah notices she's withdrawn, quiet, and just unhappy. But things were about to change for the better. Because while Melissa didn't have her driver's license, didn't have much money, didn't have a job, and didn't have a phone, she did have plenty of experience babysitting. This made her the perfect companion for the energetic Pilar Rodriguez.
She kept putting his hand on my thigh.
You ever have sex with her?
No,
You ever touch anything of it?
just that way.
She started taking care of Pilar, and she just started brightening up and had smiles on her face, and she would laugh, Deborah said of Melissa's change in mood. She would wash her hair and put barrettes in it. As mentioned, Melissa already had a rough go at life thus far, having to cope with the challenges of an adolescent going through the intense environment of peer-based pressure. Despite having friends, Melissa suffered from shyness, she didn't think she was pretty, and she only grew more reclusive because she was made fun of for her lazy eye. Pilar therefore represented another opportunity for Melissa not just to be happy again, but to get paid for it. Or at least some of the time. Marco, who said he paid Melissa $65 a week when he could, struggled with the money, but Melissa said she wasn't too bothered by it. Pilar ate regularly, wore clean clothes, and she was in a home environment perfectly suited for her care, Melissa would say. She was, notwithstanding any of that, a healthy child. So comfortable were Marco and Deborah with Pilar and Melissa's care that they agreed to allow her to take the child on an overnight trip to Punta Gorda in January 1999. Then, at the end of that same month, Melissa told Deborah and Marco that she was going to take Pilar on another trip to Punta Gorda, but this time with no set day that she would return. It was the very last time that they would see Pilar, alive or dead. Melissa gave Marco a phone number on a piece of paper to call if they needed anything. By then, it didn't matter what Deborah or Marco said. Being employed full-time, there was no way Deborah, her younger daughter, or Marco were going to be able to care for Pilar. Besides, it wasn't uncommon for Marco to hand over Pilar in the care of strangers, he would later admit. In an interview with Melissa years later, lawyers would use the word pawned to describe how Pilar was handed off to her with no real affordable alternative. But Melissa kept her mother abreast of what was going on while she stayed at the trail apartment. She would go to that same Circle K store just steps away from her short-term rental and use the outdoor payphone to give her mother and sister peace of mind updates. Everything, Melissa would say on those calls, was just fine.
What happened with the little girl after he found that he was sexually harassing you?
I think you kind of lost it.
Like how?
Where is my daughter? Marco recalled asking the first person to pick up the phone after dialing the number Melissa gave him. The call is believed to have been made on Sunday, February 21, 1999, 3 weeks after Melissa took Pilar to Punta Gorda. It was the first time Marco had been able to get a hold of someone in days. He said he'd been trying to reach Melissa every day after the first 2 weeks of their trip, but he couldn't. He wanted his daughter home now. Through a translator in a Charlotte County court 18 years later in 2017, Marco would say that the male voice on the other end of the line told him he was a friend of someone named Keith Wilson, that he didn't know where his daughter was, and that Melissa had gone to see her sister in Wisconsin. Marco had been freaking out. It took him several minutes to find Deborah, who subsequently called Melissa's older sister from the laundromat payphone to confirm that the babysitter was, for some reason, in Wisconsin. Marco and Deborah then called emergency services to report Pilar missing at 9:33 p.m. on the 22nd. Marco, who grabbed the phone from Deborah in hysterics, tells police in broken English that Melissa gave him a phone number for a Keith Wilson. Hours later at 2:45 a.m. on the 23rd, Virginia Wilson snaps her eyelids open to a loud knocking on her home door at 5052 Duncan Road in Punta Gorda. Standing in front of the door were deputies from the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office, and they wanted to speak with her grandson, 27-year-old Keith Wilson. Keith squints at his grandmother, who is nudging him awake from the bed inside his primary residence. She tells him there are police officers outside. When the over 6 feet tall, 250-pound man gets to the door, the deputies tell him they are investigating the disappearance of a now 4-year-old named Pilar Rodriguez. Keith tells him he's familiar with the child, that he was the boyfriend of Melissa, and that he would follow investigators to the police department to provide a written statement. In that statement, he writes the following. Melissa called January 1999 early to come over to visit by herself. Next visit, end of January. Came over, had Pilar with her 2 days. Stayed at Motel 6 on Jones Loop. Both went back to Hollywood. 1.5 weeks later, Melissa and Pilar returned to Trail Apartment. Melissa and Pilar stayed at apartment while I was at work. While I was at work, I would go check on them. When I got in on the nights, if was not too late. After about 1 week I came in. She was in bed and had been in hospital, and said that Pilar was with her dad Marco. At this time, she was in bed, kind of slow, not knowing what was going on around her. 1 week later, after not being able to have her sister Ellen come down from West Milwaukee, she then went up there. She left on Sunday 14th February. She was called since she had been gone. Said had been snowing. She would be coming back soon. When she travels, she takes Greyhound, but when she left out of Fort Myers, she'd flown on ATA and her flight was around 2 p.m. When she left, She was by herself. Keith then left the police department. Not even an hour later, police from Hollywood, Florida contacted their counterparts in Caledonia, Wisconsin at 3 a.m. to assist in locating Pilar and Melissa. It was at 3:49 a.m. on the 23rd of February 1999 when police descended on Melissa's sister's residence and searched the property for the child, with no luck. In her initial statement, police said that 3 weeks earlier, on February 2, she fell ill from a diabetic episode and went to get medicine for herself. Her boyfriend Keith, who was a semi-truck driver transporting wastewater, was out at work that night, so Pilar was alone in the apartment. When Melissa returned to the apartment, she said the child was gone. When Keith came home from work later that night, Melissa said she told him that Marco came and picked her up. Police noted in a report detailing the statement that Melissa sat upright, had her hands resting on her lap, and showed little emotion. Meanwhile, detectives asked Keith to come in later on the day he gave that statement as they obtained more information from Melissa.
I'm Detective Valentine, Murder Shop Sheriff's Office. Today's date is February 23rd, 1999. Time now is 6:32 p.m. And here again, we're trying to ask for your help. Find out what happened. What's going on?
Do you remember exactly what he was saying, or?
He was just mainly asking about Melissa. He just wanted me to ask for not mine to get a hold of Melissa. So, that he needed to talk to Melissa.
Why did he get upset with you on the phone?
He thought, well, he asked where she was, and I said, she's in Wisconsin. He said, like, Wisconsin? I said, yeah, Wisconsin, where's her sister at? And what's she doing up there? I said, well, went to see her sister. But while she wanted to see her sister, I tried to get her sister to come down here, which was going to buy her a plane ticket to come down. I stayed down here and see her, but she couldn't leave from up there, so she decided to go up there.
Melissa ever say how he treated Pilar?
She always said that he always just left her places. So, she was there one time, he tried to throw in a trash can and stuff, a couple of times, and I know I had seen some marks on her when she was over here. Mm-hmm. But, my understanding that I heard, is that, he didn't really get her, At one time, she had said that her mom had even asked her if they would take care of her. At one time, who's there? If her and her mom and sister would take care of her, I just tell him, because he couldn't handle her. How come? I don't know. He just said he just couldn't handle her, what they told me.
What did the sheriff's office tell you last time?
They had said that he had called, they had contacted them saying that she was missing. And they had said, Melissa had said that she had lost her or something. I don't know what, that's all I heard. They told me that she had said that she had lost her.
When was the last time you heard from Melissa?
This is the other night she called.
The other night, a couple nights ago, 3, 4, 5,
The other night when she called before they, about 8 o'clock that night. Last night, saying, she told me about it snowed and so.
Did you tell her that Marco had been calling for her?
I told her one time that Marco had tried to get a hold of her. She didn't say that.
She had no reaction at all.
She just changed the subject,
He doesn't have Pilar. Melissa doesn't have Pilar. You don't have Pilar.
I don't have Pilar.
So Pilar's missing.
Yeah,
So let me ask you, how did you get along with Pilar?
she listened pretty good to me. I tell her, don't do that, don't do this, and seemed to get along pretty good.
Mm-hmm. You seem like a pretty easygoing guy.
Kids always, most of the kids I've been around, they get along with me pretty good. Got a little baby sister, she's 3.
Did Pilar like you?
So I guess she did. I mean, she got along with me okay. Seemed to get along pretty good with me.
How'd you get along with Pilar?
I got along pretty good with her.
You said she treated you pretty good?
Yeah, I mean, I could, tell her something, say, don't do that, or, go do this, or go do that, and I mean, she pretty well would.
Oh, she minded Melissa?
She didn't mind her as well. I mean, Melissa said she'd have trouble, but like whenever I was around, she would say she listens to me a whole lot better than she did her.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, she was kind of a loose cannon there, with her dad and living with Melissa's mother and everything. Did you ever have to discipline her anything or spank her or something like that?
Never had to spank her.
Never?
I raised my voice, just like any kid, that don't do that. You just raise your voice. Say, listen.
Okay.
Like I say, I've never had no trouble with kids. My uncle, he's got 3 kids, 3 boys, and she would try to push herself a little bit just to see what she could get by with.
Typical kid.
Yeah. I mean, any of them. Well, let's see what I can get by with here, but she listened pretty good,
How do you feel about Melissa?
I like her.
Love her?
Pretty much did, yeah.
I don't marry her or anything.
We talked about it, but get an engagement ring and stuff like that. I told her I wanted, take it slow, don't rush into stuff. Make sure, that's what she wants. Because, when I drive a truck, I said, hey, I'm not here all the time. It's going to be rough on you. I said, you sure you can handle it,
Melissa didn't say anything about
She's never would. No, she never did mention it. Like I say, the one time I asked her, she said she's with her daddy. So, she said, well, the way she said it when she come over, she said she won't be here long and all that stuff. I'm just babysitting. So,
So when she came here, she said that Mark was going to come pick her up here?
well, she said he would either come over or she'd have to take her back one of the two. They would make arrangements, That's what I'd like to know, I'd like to find out what he's going on too, whether if he did come over or not, or what happened.
Well, if he did come over and pick her up, why would he be saying this now?
Like I say, he's always leaving her places, all I know. If they left her somewhere or something's happened to her, I don't know. But that's why I say, best that I know is that she told me that she had went back with her daddy.
As this was happening, police collected a statement from Marco about his interactions with Melissa. Near the end of that statement, when asked if he wanted to add anything, Marco said Melissa told him, "What's up if I kidnap your daughter?" Marco would later say that he didn't recall the statement and that he was extremely hysterical at the time he was providing it. He cried throughout the ride home by the transporting Hollywood deputy. He was in such a bad way that he asked the deputy to stop by an outdoor altar so he could pray and put a missing girl flyer there. Both Keith and Melissa denied having any involvement in Pilar's disappearance, which was its own problem for investigators. A bigger problem was the fact that, despite evidence collected at the scene, they couldn't match any of it without a body. That is, again, if she was dead in the first place. All investigators now had were the words of Melissa and Keith and a box of evidence that was about to sit in storage collecting cobwebs for years. Still, Pilar was top of mind for investigators. Detective Michael Gandy would say that whenever a call would come in about an odor, bird activity, or anything suspicious, Pilar was the first thing that would come to mind. And even as the years passed by them, with searches becoming far less grand and detectives on the case either retiring or moving on to part-time work, Detective Gandy never forgot. And it's a good thing he didn't, because the county was about to be reinvigorated by the election in 2008 of a new sheriff with a different mindset on unsolved crimes. Bill Cameron was his name, and he decided to overhaul the county's approach to investigating cold cases. The sheriff ordered the formation by Detective Gandy of the Cold Case Unit, which would be made up of retired and part-time law enforcement guys, including from places outside of the state. The idea was to bring guys with no allegiances to make critical assessments of what went wrong in investigations, and to carve a path forward for them. One of the very first cases this unit took up was the Pilar Rodriguez case. And while cold cases often require more work because detectives must explore old and new avenues, they weren't without leads and suspects. Because during her initial 3-hour interview in Wisconsin, Melissa changed her story and gave a second version, in which she stated Keith slapped Pilar and at some point she fell and hit her head. She added that Pilar died as a result of the accident and was taken away by Keith to be buried somewhere.
He hit her pretty hard and she got her head knocked against the wall and the floor.
What did he use to hit?
His hand.
Open, closed?
Open.
Open.
I was hysterical. I was breathing heavy. I couldn't stop.
What was he saying when he was crying all over?
He was saying he was sorry. He didn't mean for that to happen. He kept saying over and over he didn't mean for this to happen.
Well, what did he do to say he was sorry?
By causing the spot on her head, it wasn't his intention to do anything like that.
Well, if it wasn't intentional, why did he get rid of the Pilar like he did?
Scared, panicky, like anybody else would be if that happened to them.
Knowing that people knew that you had Pilar, what were you going to tell them? If you had seen them again and you didn't have Pilar?
That she was missing the day I got back from the hospital.
And who came up with that idea?
I did.
You ever hit Pilar?
I think so.
Yeah. When was the first time you ever gave her a spanking?
In my mom's apartment.
How would you spank her? You slap her across the cheek?
No. I have claps on her ears.
With what, your hand? Did Keith hit Pilar because of what Marco was going to?
I think so.
When confronted by this information, Keith denied all of it. Keith would eventually move back to Kentucky and have 2 daughters of his own. In 2004, Melissa got married to a man uninvolved in the case in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, where they stayed for a month before moving to Linwood, Washington for his job. The couple would have 2 boys. In 2005, she finally got her driver's license. It was a dream life that she, since at least 1999, always wanted to have.
Not gonna go away. I don't know. It's not gonna go away. What happened happened. It ain't gonna go away. You gotta get it out, man. You gotta get it out. I've not got nothing to get out. You can do that. But inside it's killing you. Mine is not gonna help you. It's not going to help anybody. And the most important part of helping you, it's not going to help you in here. Well, if y'all want to accuse me of something, I need to get somebody in there to represent me. Because I don't know, it sounds like y'all are trying to say that I got something with her.
Dr. Ivan Kiselev was the forensic manager at the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office when he was visited in 2009 by detectives from the newly formed Cold Case Unit to have a look at some evidence collected a decade prior from Unit 11 of the trail apartments. Specifically, the detectives wanted to know whether the hairs collected by investigators at the apartment were shed, pulled, or cut. Up to this point, Melissa had given several statements to detectives about what occurred in that apartment a decade earlier. But when detectives came knocking again unannounced at her Washington home in October 2009, she was ready to give the definitive account. A decade on and Melissa was all grown up, she matured, she had a family, and ultimately, she extricated herself from the fog of love. In her multiple different versions of what happened in Unit 11, none included an important detail that she would give to cold case detectives that October. At some point during their stay in the trail apartments, Keith plopped a chair down next to the bathroom and cut Pilar's hair short. The idea was that if investigators could match the DNA from the hairs to a prospective child of Marco and Pamela, they could prove that Pilar was, in fact, in the apartment. While Dr. Kiselev was not an expert in this field, he looked at the hair under a microscope and concluded that, in his opinion, the hair had been cut because there was no tissue at the base that would have indicated extraction at the root. This finding was confirmed by an FBI expert in this field. The hairs were then whisked off to Patricia Agard, at the time a forensic examiner in the mitochondrial DNA unit at the FBI lab. Patricia explained in a Charlotte County court that there are two forms of DNA, nuclear and mitochondria. We inherit half our nuclear DNA from our father and half from our mother, and only mitochondrial DNA from the mother. The latter is not unique to the individual, but, unlike nuclear DNA, it can be found in hair shafts and degraded pieces of evidence. By this point, forensic examiners had already identified blood on the carpet swatches and the sponge mop, samples which were handed to Patricia to determine whether these pieces of evidence could be those of a child of the still-alive parents, Marco and Pamela. The DNA samples were imperfect, and that could be for several reasons: DNA mixing, an incomplete profile, or degradation from, say, the use of cleaning products. The two key pieces of evidence to make an identification, the carpet swatches and the sponge mop, had mixed or partial DNA, and the DNA test from 1999 was limited in making an identification from those imperfections. What is called short tandem repeat or STR testing was still in its infancy at the time, but a decade on, the testing became more sophisticated. Patricia first found that the hairs in the blood sample both had the same mitochondrial DNA sequences as each other. She also found that she could safely exclude Keith and Melissa as the originators of the hair, and that she could not rule out that the hair came from the matrilineal line associated with Pilar. In simpler terms, investigators were able to show Pilar was in the apartment. That was a huge break because it proved one link in the chain of proof for a crime with no body. And their luck was not about to run out. Lisa Wilson, an aunt of Keith's, came to law enforcement to tell them a story she said she was only remembering now. Lisa recalls the day because it was her birthday, February 6, 1999. She and her husband stopped by the house of Virginia Wilson, Keith's grandmother, who babysat two of Lisa's children. When we pulled in the driveway, Keith's car was sitting there facing the field, she told a Charlotte County court in 2017. We pulled in facing the road right next to him. When I got out, his trunk was open and he had shovels and things in his trunk. Virginia came out of her house and she was very upset that someone had moved her tree, Lisa said, adding, I had seen the shovel, looked at him, and I said, "You're in trouble."
A major lead in a 10-year-old case sends investigators to a Punta Gorda ranch. They're searching for the body of a missing 3-year-old. SNN Local News 6 reporter Grant Boxleiter has been at the search site all day. He joins us now live with the latest on this. Grant.
And Lauren, 4 sheriffs here in Charlotte County have come and gone since Pilar Rodriguez first went missing in 1999. Now a new tip has led them here to this ranch behind me, where tonight they're searching for new clues. A case of a missing 3-year-old that went cold more than 10 years ago is heating up again in Charlotte County.
We suspect this is a homicide case investigation of Pilar Rodriguez.
There's now a massive search taking place on an 8-acre ranch off US 17 east of Punta Gorda.
I would say that we've gotten information on this particular lead that is the best we've had in the 11 years.
Rodriguez went missing in February 1999 while staying with babysitter Melissa Cooper. Sheriff Bill Cameron says both Cooper and her boyfriend Keith Wilson are still considered suspects in the case.
People who still live on this property are related to one of the initial suspects in this case, and they still live here. They just don't own the property.
Search crews that include the FBI used ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They paid close attention to a tree in the front yard where they started digging.
It was one of these news segments that caught and held Jesse Clapham's attention. It was earlier that year, 2009, when the shrimp boat employee of Fort Myers Beach caught on TV a similar news segment about the excavation of Virginia Wilson's property in Punta Gorda. Jesse remembers first hearing about the Pilar Rodriguez case in the same way, on TV, back in 1999. But he's not just any spectator. He had information about the case. One news segment had a phone number to call if someone wanted to share information. Jesse dials that number and meets with Detective Kurt Mell and Detective Gandy on November 4, 2009. He told them that they are going to want to hear him out, and he didn't want anything in exchange to tell it. Jesse had spent 18 months at the Gulf Correctional Institution for robbery before he was released on January 1, 2009. Inside, he met a man named Bo Gulf. The two men had never met before, but they bonded over a strange coincidence. They were both related to Keith Wilson.
Keith Wilson, I'm related to him. He is a cousin by marriage.
Jesse's uncle, Albert, or Bert Clapham, married Keith's mom before they divorced in the mid-80s, so he was Keith's stepfather at some point. Keith was older than Jesse, and the two would go fishing every now and then. This wasn't a close bond, but they were friendly for the most part, Jesse said.
Now, you had a relationship with Keith before and after this incident, correct?
Yes, sir.
And describe for the record what that relationship was.
We just, we were cousins. We'd go out and go drinking, he was older, could buy beer and drive, so he would take us to the skate rink or take us out, pick up some friends and go drinking.
Okay, so he was older than you?
Yes, sir.
And so you've had experiences with him. Did he like to drink?
No, he didn't like to drink too much.
Okay. But he would drink?
Yes. He would mainly get us to drinking.
What was strange to Jesse was that in the 2 or 3 years before Pilar's disappearance, Keith wasn't hanging around the family that much. That changed, however, after the little girl's disappearance. And why would that be? Because Bert and Jesse's father, Marlon Clapham, were very, very bad men. Every single piece of court testimony describing the two men was, for the most part, about their life of crime. Bert's daughter testified that Marlon and her father, who had a bad relationship with alcohol and drugs, were people to be feared.
They were abusive. They were in drug dealing. They just were not law-abiding citizens. My dad went to prison for bank robbery. They've had several DUIs. They sold drugs. They, battery on their wives. Not good stuff.
Okay.
So who better to go for advice about concealing a crime than these two? According to Jesse's story, on one night in February 1999, Keith drove up to Marlon's home in San Carlos Park on East Carnegie Circle in South Fort Myers.
Keith had showed up to where we was staying. And it was late at night because I was concerned why he was there that late at night. And Keith and my uncle and my dad were surrounding a car. They were discussing something in the trunk. And I approached the car and I approached the car and looked in the trunk to see what they had in there, and they had a but all I seen was a that looked like a young.
Okay. And this was in the trunk of the car?
Yes, sir.
Florida law exempts from public disclosure depictions of the killing of a minor, hence the redactions you hear, which were made through the FOIA process. But we know from other primary sources that Jesse here is saying he saw what looked like a purple foot sticking out of a pink blanket in the trunk on the driver's side of Keith's car. Jesse, in fact, illustrated what he saw in 1999 on paper here. Jesse alleged Keith told him that he put Pilar's body in a septic tank. This would make sense because Keith transported wastewater. As to why he would confide in him such information, Jesse said it was probably because Jesse had confided in Keith some bad secrets that he had himself, so there was some level of trust there.
Did you ever discuss with your father or your uncle after you heard this from Keith about this Pilar Rodriguez case?
Yes. We had discussed Keith in the case several different times about everybody was concerned about Keith's going to jail. Everybody was concerned about Keith going to jail for this because we all, everybody knew that he did it, so they were just trying to figure out how to get him out of it.
Okay, when you say everybody knew that Keith did it, who would everybody be aside from yourself?
Me, my dad, and my uncle.
Okay, so just the three of you?
Yes. Was at the house several times while they were draining the lake and after they drained the lake, and he was saying he wasn't worried about them draining the lake because they wasn't going to find nothing in there.
Now, Jesse, you saw by your own statement, you saw or maybe the body of Keith Wilson's trunk, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever tell any police officer?
No, sir.
Why not?
Just the way I was raised, and it was like a family secret, and I was raised with a criminal background, so that was just something we didn't talk about. That if something happened and you could cover it up or get away with it, that was my Uncle Bert and my dad's mentality.
So you were raised not to really talk to police?
Yes, sir. That was their mentality, is if you can do it and get away with it, then don't worry about it. Yeah, I think he felt remorseful for it. He was sorry that it happened, but I don't think if he was sorry that it happened or if he was just sorry of the situation he put himself in.
There was a situation that arose that your Uncle Albert, and Keith Wilson had somewhat of a altercation.
Yes, sir.
And describe for the record what that was all about.
Keith came to stay with my uncle, and after everybody went to bed, they woke up and they found Keith in bed with my uncle's, which is Keith's stepsister. They found him in bed with her, and she was probably 8 or 9 years old, and he was in there kissing on her and rubbing on her and stuff.
What did Uncle Albert do with Keith?
He roughed him up a little bit and run him off and told him never come back around.
Okay. Did he ever discuss in your presence anything at that point in time about Keith and Pilar Rodriguez?
He was stating that he understood what happened to Pilar Rodriguez after he had caught Keith molesting Cody. He understood what happened to the little girl, and he was saying that she actually didn't been molesting her, and something went wrong, and he killed her.
Okay, so that I have this clear, because of what happened, your Uncle Albert, what happened to his daughter, the kissing and rubbing on her by Keith Wilson, inappropriately, I assume, he felt that maybe there was more to the Pilar Rodriguez incident than just a simple...
Yes, sir.
So why are you telling us this now?
Because for one, it's the right thing to do. For two, I have kids of my own, and I wouldn't want to see them molested. And after I've been to prison and I seen what happens, I see what happens to people that do molest kids, and for him to be running the street free is just wrong. My conscience just won't let me not do it.
Jesse also said he was more comfortable coming forward because before he went to prison in May 2008, both Marlon and Bert, who would disown Jesse if he spilled family secrets, died within a year of each other. Before they could move for an arrest warrant, detectives needed to complete the massive undertaking of going through the volumes of the case file after getting Melissa's additional statement in October 2009, which corroborated what Jesse Clapham said, such as the color of Pilar when she was taken away, and then getting the requisite forensic testing done. Investigators were finally ready to start proceedings to put this case to bed. On July 16, 2013, nearly 4 years after Jesse's and Melissa's statements, Kentucky State Trooper James Farrell arrived with 2 Florida detectives at a gas station in Owingsville called Ed's Goody Mart at just after 8 a.m. They were waiting for confirmation on an arrest warrant to be served to the primary suspect in the murder of Pilar Rodriguez. After they got the go-ahead, they drove down to a home in Owingsville and knocked on the door. In almost identical circumstances 14 years earlier, a woman came to the door and was told what was going on. She said he was in bed, but that they could come in. Keith Wilson had just been getting up from bed when the deputy and the detectives walked inside. We advised him that there was a warrant for him out of Florida and that he was under arrest, James told a Charlotte County court. When he was in the back of the cruiser, he asked if this was about the child. I told him I didn't know, James said. Keith was driven to Mount Sterling Police Department, about 12 miles west of where he was living.
Okay, Keith, let me explain something to you before you respond. I know what you've said in the past. This is eye to eye, man to man. Okay? Yeah. I know how you were brought up. I know the things that have happened to you in your childhood. I know the situation that you found yourself in and didn't know any better because the environment that you were brought up in wasn't anything that you didn't know on a fairly regular basis. And I'm talking about your stepdad. Okay? I know that. And I don't know if you know anything about victims of abuse, children victims of abuse, but if you've done any studying or if you've had any counseling, children who are victims of abuse tend, more often than not, to grow up to become like their abusers.
Like him.
Okay?
Yeah.
So I know what happened. I know the motive behind, not the motive, that's the wrong word. I know the history that resulted in what happened. I have evidence to substantiate that. My goal is to be able to call the grandmother and say, come get your baby. Or, if I can't say that, this is what happened to your baby. And this is where. And this, so she has something to close, to hold on to. Because right now, she doesn't have anything. And I know that Marco can be impetuous and can be hard, but deep down I know Marco wants that closure. And I know that Pilar's mother is also wants to know.
I'll tell you right now, I've told him before.
I know what you've told him before, Keith, but I'm going to tell you right now that what you told him isn't the truth.
Yeah,
and I can prove it.
It is the truth.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you, okay? That's why I'm saying it. I don't want you to lie to me. I already know.
I've showed him everywhere I was. The only reason I had her over there is because I felt sorry for the girl. She needed a place. I didn't know she was bringing the little girl with her. All I done is she told me that Marco had raped her. The law officers down there would not listen. Nothing I had to say. All they
Okay,
done.
stop.
Well, I'm trying to
All right.
tell you.
Well, I don't want you to continue to tell me something that I know isn't true, so stop and listen to me.
Well, people up
I know
there-
when you met Melissa.
up here.
I know where you met Melissa.
Yeah.
I know what happened with Melissa. I know about the spouse abuse. I know about the physical beating. I know about the frying pan on the back of her back. I know about all this stuff.
I never hit her frying pan. She was getting ready to take decon and run into a door, and she had the thing right there on her face.
Keith.
I'm done.
Keith,
I'm done. Because I'm tired of people telling me something that I've done, and I didn't do it. I've never touched her.
So
I've never touched Melissa. I've always been good. And everybody come up here telling me that I hit her with a frying pan, and she went to work that day. I said, how would a girl go to work if a man my size hit her with a frying pan?
Keith.
I'm done talking. I won't lawyer.
Okay, no problem.
As he was being driven to the Bath County Courthouse in Owingsville after being questioned, James alleged Keith stated several times that this is crazy and that they can't prove anything because they don't have a body.
Melissa says you came home in a bad mood, had a bad day. Okay?
Yeah.
Pilar wouldn't listen to you, and you had to discipline her. Alright?
I've never had a discipline her.
She still wouldn't listen. Kids are stubborn. Kids are stubborn.
Donna Harris was a co-owner of the Trail Apartments when she received a call from Keith Wilson on Valentine's Day, 1999. Keith wanted to terminate the lease on Unit 11 immediately, but Donna told him that he needed to provide 3 days' notice, according to a statement she gave Charlotte County Sheriff's detectives on February 23, 1999. But Keith pleaded with her. He said he had gotten a job in Fort Lauderdale and that he really needed to move out. After some thought, she agreed and made arrangements to meet Keith an hour after the call. During this time, Melissa's vacuuming the carpet, making the bed, cleaning the bathroom sink and tub, and wiping the kitchen floor and counters and packing her suitcase. After the inspection, Keith asked Donna if the unit was clean enough, to which Donna said that, in fact, she was surprised how clean the apartment was, considering that most people leave these apartments with some trash and grease on the stove. It looked like they never lived there, you know, she told detectives. It was like they were never there because even the bed cover was clean. In fact, she said, she could move the other tenants in far sooner than normal because of the cleanliness. Melissa did all the cleaning, because that's just how the relationship went. When Donna came to do the inspection, she saw a dirty blonde woman who she said appeared nervous and never smiled. The two then went to a local Walmart, which was decorated with Valentine's Day colors. There, Keith told Melissa to pick up the payphone and call her sister in Wisconsin and tell her that she wanted to visit, but not to mention anything about Pilar unprompted. When her sister confirmed she could come over, Keith purchased a $200 one-way ticket to Milwaukee for Melissa, later following up with her on 2 phone calls to ensure she stuck to the story they were to tell police. And with that, Keith intended to forever sever ties with his one-time romantic interest after a night that turned Ari inside Unit 11. But Melissa clung on to hope, because after being interrogated for hours, she would later write letters professing her love to him. Her love for him can also be seen in her lies during interrogation. With every story, she tried to push what happened to Pilar away from her and Keith. It went from the child was picked up by her father to minimizing Keith's involvement in hurting the child. Melissa, who was perhaps lovesick, said she wasn't thinking straight when she went back to Punta Gorda to see Keith after her interrogation. She got lost looking for his grandmother's place, but was eventually guided by strangers. Keith was surprised and upset by her presence. He tried to feel her to see if she was wearing a wire, but she wasn't. The police, Melissa said, didn't know what she was doing that day. She said she was trying to get Keith to confess and tell police where he put the child's body. Melissa said he was whispering because he was still suspicious, telling her that he can't tell anybody because they'll give him the electric chair. That conversation ended when his lawyer called him and told him not to speak with her. He then got his grandmother to take her back to the bus station. It would be the very last face-to-face confrontation they would have until they would meet again 18 years later in a Charlotte County court.
Melissa says, if you came home from work, came to the apartments, had a bad day.
But I had a bad day every day work on it.
And Pilar wouldn't listen to you.
She's always listening to me.
Well, this particular day, she didn't listen to you very well.
Melissa said Keith would come to the McDonald's where she was employed as cashier 3 times a week way back in January, February 1998. I would see him come in really often, and he would just sit in the lobby and watch all the young girls, Melissa's mother Deborah recalls about Keith as she worked the drive-thru. That attention then shifted to Melissa, who had never before that point been on a date. The two started flirting with each other at the cash register before Keith asked her out on a date. I liked the attention I was getting, Melissa would say in court 18 years later. Deborah recalls that they started dating about a week before the Coopers were supposed to move to Florida. Their first date was at a movie theater. The second was sex at his house, but Melissa said he was being really pushy about it. And the third was the same as the second, and would be the last before the Coopers moved down to the Sunshine State, the details of which were discussed with Keith as they sat at a table in the lobby outside the McDonald's. Deborah was at the table, but she recalls in court that Keith acted like he didn't want to have anything to do with me. I tried to enter into a friendly conversation because he's interested in my daughter. Keith offered no pleasantries, no conversation, and no attention to Deborah, Mama Cooper would say. His focus was solely on Melissa. Born on the Azores Islands in the mid-Atlantic, it is believed Keith Wilson never got to know his biological father. Instead, his father figure was Bert Clapham, the aforementioned very, Very bad man. Keith's aunt Lisa said Keith could be a nice person, but he could also be moody and angry. He was rough, playful sometimes, but too rough for his size, she would say. Keith wasn't wealthy and he wasn't generous with his money, she would go on. He would go to eat at everyone else's houses, but never reciprocated. He was employed at gas station Cofer Chevron in '98, the local dollar store in early 2000, and by what was then a company called J&J Baker, a wastewater and septic tank firm, which would eventually take him down to Florida on one important trip. Because after only weeks of being down south, Melissa wanted to go back to Kentucky to stay with Keith. She left a note for her mother about her return trip with Keith and hitched a ride back with him when he came down to pick up a load from Lakeland for work. Karen Kirkpatrick was one of the employees at the McDonald's in Owingsville who was concerned about Melissa's well-being after she returned. She explained to a Charlotte County court that Melissa would show up with bruises on her body. She was quiet around him, only opening up around her colleagues, and he would often berate her, coming before her shift ended and telling her to get her fat ass in the car or he'd leave without her. Melissa said in the 5 or 6 months she lived with him, the couple would almost never go out. Under his rule, in which he controlled her money, Keith would abuse her emotionally, mentally, and physically, she alleged. She said she was slapped in the mouth for answering the phone, body slammed, and choked regularly. She didn't have a license, a bank account, or money, and her co-workers were her only friends. She recalled an incident in which he tied her dog Samantha to the undercarriage of his truck because she tried biting him when he tried to touch Melissa, who said she was hit in the face on that same trip back. It was a hot day, and he refused to give the dog water. She died a day later. She said he also killed the replacement dog and her hamster and physically stopped her from intervening. To keep her quiet, Melissa said he told her that he was a volunteer firefighter who knew all of the law enforcement people in Kentucky. Explicitly, he was conveying that if she tried to run to the cops, they wouldn't believe her. Implicitly, he was conveying the abuse would get worse if she tried. But Melissa, the woman with admittedly low self-esteem, could not let go. I thought maybe what was going on in Kentucky was my fault, she said in a 2014 deposition in Everett, Washington. He was the first man I had ever been with, she said. I wanted to try again. She continued to communicate with Keith after her move back to Hollywood. Keith moved in with his grandmother in Punta Gorda in December 1998. They arranged to meet again in Punta Gorda via a Greyhound bus that went to a Fort Myers bus station, where he picked her up using a car he purchased on January 1. They stayed at the Knights Inn on Jones Loop Road in Punta Gorda for the night. The subsequent trip, however, would be different because no one else could care for Pilar. She told Keith about the situation, but he told her not to fret and that she can bring the child over. The first trip with Pilar went off without a hitch, his demeanor described by Melissa as very friendly. It was a simple overnighter with dinner in between, but there was a difference. While they would normally get intimate, Melissa didn't like the idea of having intercourse with the child in the room. She said he would paw at her, but she declined to escalate. Melissa said he was frustrated by that. The couple would soon be discussing the final trip over the phone, this time for an indefinite period. Keith would pay for the 2 weeks up front for Unit 11 of the trail apartments in the interim. For Melissa, this trip to Punta Gorda was supposed to be sort of a test case for the viability of a long-term relationship between the two, but Melissa's resolve would be tested within the first 2 days. Melissa required insulin shots every day to function properly, but she said Keith withheld her medication. That's the reason she had a diabetic episode that landed her at Charlotte Regional on February 2, just 2 days after they arrived at the apartment. That incident would be used as the convenient excuse for the horror to come later. Otherwise, there was no physical abuse, until roughly day 3, Melissa said. He would not put up with the disobedience in the home. For example, when Pilar tried to go outside, he slapped her and would put a dog collar around her neck and tie the other end to the bedpost. Melissa said she was stunned by that and asked why, to which she said he would laugh and say that he can do whatever he wants. He kept the two confined in the apartment. They didn't go to dinner, the park, the mall, or anywhere outside of the small studio apartment. He cut Pilar's hair short so she would look more like a boy to avoid anyone in the public recognizing her. Whenever Pilar disobeyed, he would make her stand with her arms up and out to the sides for hours, and forced her to sleep in the closet instead of the couch. And whenever Melissa tried comforting her, he would push her away. Melissa said she endured slapping, choking, body slamming, frying pan beatings, and forced sex from behind. Again, she didn't ask for help, including from her mother or sisters, because she thought it would get worse. In fact, occasionally, he would force her to go to the Circle K convenience store and make phone calls back home to Hollywood and tell her family that everything was fine. But when she returned to the apartment, she would see a quiet and scared Pilar crouched in the corner with Keith sitting on the bed. Another time, she caught the both of them naked on the bed, but she said she didn't see anything beyond that. It is believed that Keith did what you are thinking. Then one day, he came home from work angry. It's not clear from the record what precipitated it. Inmates at a jail where Keith was staying said they overheard him say that he hit the child after saying she wouldn't stop crying. Melissa had said she once told Keith that Marco allegedly inappropriately touched her, and that's what Keith told investigators in his 2013 statement.
All I done is she told me that Marco had raped her. The law officers down there would not listen.
Whatever the reason, the definitive account is that he punched Pilar in the back of the head with a closed fist and then pushed her. The child fell back and hit the back of her head against the bathroom door jamb, which is the door frame. Pilar fell to the floor and started crying. Melissa tried to intervene, but he pushed her away. She then said she grabbed their suitcases and declared that she was leaving with Pilar, but was blocked from getting to the door. Keith then pushed her on the bed, bent her over, pulled her pants down, and forced himself on her, she said. As this was happening, Melissa said Pilar got up on her own and sat on the couch. Keith then picked her up, put her on his lap, and started bouncing her on his knee like he was her father. She eventually became quiet. It would be the last time he would hit her, both because he just stopped and because, eventually, he wouldn't be able to if he wanted. That's because Pilar's condition deteriorated after the door jam incident. That night, and in the following days, she complained of stomach pain and diarrhea. She was far more lethargic, and she slept a lot more. She had less of an appetite. One day, as she was doing Pilar's hair, Melissa said she felt a soft, mushy spot on the back of the child's head. She said she asked Pilar if she wanted to go to the hospital, but the tot said no. On the afternoon of the second or third day after the incident, while Keith was at work, Melissa said she noticed Pilar lying on the couch unresponsive. She was covered in a blanket and didn't look like she was breathing. When Keith got home, Melissa told him about her condition and said they needed to take her to the hospital, but Keith declined, saying the doctors would see the bruises. Melissa said Keith put the child on the floor, which caused the blood spots on the carpet, and attempted CPR for 5 minutes with no response. He then put her in the shower to try to wake her, but nothing. He then picked her up in a cradle position, walked out of the bathroom, and declared to Melissa that she was dead. He then placed her in a garbage bag and put her in the trunk of his car to go bury her. That's when, it is presumed, he took her body to Bert and Marlon. Her body was never found. Melissa then said she stayed in the apartment for the night before they arranged the trip to Wisconsin the next day. Keith told her to provide the police and anyone concerned about Pilar the story about how, when she was in the hospital, her father came and picked her up. Before Keith was arrested in July 2013, Melissa went in front of a Charlotte County court at 8 a.m. that day and took a plea deal that downgraded a charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child, which carried a max penalty of 30 years in prison, to accessory after the fact. Part of that plea deal, which greenlit the arrest warrant for Keith Wilson that day, was to testify truthfully against the man she once loved. I'm being held accountable for standing by and letting somebody else hurt that child, and I covered up the crime by telling lies to the police and helped clean the apartment, Melissa would say in that court testimony in 2017. I feel guilty every single day. I can never get it out of my mind. When I see my 2 boys, when I see my children, I'm reminded of how her life was cut short. She can't go to middle school. She can't ride her bike around the block like they can. Melissa received a 10-year suspended sentence, which means she will serve no prison time. Instead, she was on 2 years of community control supervised by officers, followed by 8 years of probation. Her mitigating circumstances included her cooperation in the case, her need for mental health treatment, and that she was under extreme duress or under the domination of another person when it all happened. Keith took the stand and denied just about everything related to the abuse and to hitting Pilar and causing her death. Why wouldn't Melissa call for help if this is what happened? The line of reasoning went for the defense. Why would the hospital release Melissa if she had bruises? They released her because she didn't show signs she was abused, they said, even though Melissa said that the choking didn't leave marks. The defense also tried to say that Keith was working late nights, using testimony from people in a similar line of work who said they could be gone past 8 p.m., which is around the time it is believed that the incident occurred. His defense team said the bruising on Melissa could have come from other sources, and that the credibility of witness statements was questionable. Key to the prosecution's case was Jesse Clapham's statement, who the defense tried to paint as an untrustworthy felon. Jesse said Burt and Marlon passed away right before he went to prison in 2008, which he gave as a reason for coming forward, but other testimony had him passing away years before that. They also questioned his other reasons for coming forward, including because he has children. The defense said that if he was so concerned for his children, then he wouldn't have landed himself in prison in the first place, and then again in 2010, after he gave his statement to detectives. The defense further questioned the reliability of how cushy Keith was with the Claphams, considering his mom divorced Burt in the mid-80s. Why would Keith be running around telling people the story of how he killed a child and asking them to help cover it up, especially to people he barely knew, the defense asked. But the jury wasn't swayed by Keith's story. Keith Wilson was convicted of rape and second-degree murder and will spend the rest of his life in prison. He was 46 at the time of his sentencing. Anita Wilson remembers exactly which gas station it was in Owensville, Kentucky when the conversation happened. It was in 2000 or 2001 at the Redhead gas station, a local area where people parked and socialized. Anita was in a car with her friend. Also at the station was Keith Wilson, who she knew a little bit because her sister hired him at the dollar store. People knew that he was a suspect in the case, and Anita just had to know if he really did it. In response, he said, "They can't get me because there's no body." When she asked what he did with the body, she alleged he told her, "Alligators will eat anything." Anita was immediately put off by the interaction, and she said she never spoke to him again. When Keith was arrested 12 years later, she posted on Facebook that she knew it was him. That prompted detectives to get in touch. Melissa's 2009 statement to detectives, which is considered the definitive version of what happened at the trail apartment, was withheld from a Behave FOIA request because Florida law does not allow the release of depictions of the death of a minor except a family. But that was really a cosmetic request because the truth would come out in her 2017 testimony in court. Ultimately, this is a story of fortuitous encounters with many what-ifs. What if the Coopers never moved to Florida? What if Deborah didn't talk to Marco? What if she missed Marco that night? What if the Coopers moved to Florida a week earlier? The state's closing statement included an apt descriptor of this crime. "There is something about this case that haunts people," the prosecution said. Op-eds were written about the child, key witnesses wanted to come forward, the community was engaged, the searches were grand, the detective work was relentless. It seemed like everyone wanted the child to be found. And when there was still hope, even years after she was last seen, a computer-developed image was created to show what Pilar would have likely looked like at the age of 11. She would have been 29 years old today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me narrate this story, which was based on the primary sources. Special thanks to the reporters for bringing light to these cases, to the staffs at the courts and the FOIA departments for their assistance, and to you guys for engaging in the subject matter. Be well, engage in acts of charity, and don't be Keith Wilson.